If you're fascinated by untold stories from the Second World War and its aftermath, stories that challenge what we thought we knew about occupation, reconciliation, and human dignity in the darkest times, then you're in exactly the right place. Before we begin this journey into post-war Japan, into the streets of Kure and the ruins of Hiroshima, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into history's most compelling moments. Your support helps us bring these forgotten voices back to life. Now let's step back to August 1945, to a nation holding its breath, waiting for a reckoning that would arrive in forms no one could have predicted. The heat hung thick over Kure on that final August day, when the emperor's voice crackled through radios across Japan, formal and distant, speaking words that had never been spoken before. Surrender. The war was over. In the narrow streets of the naval city, in the shadow of shipyards that had built the fleets now resting at the bottom of the Pacific, families gathered in stunned silence. The voice they had been taught was too sacred to hear directly, was now telling them their world had ended. Michiko, a seamstress who had sewn uniforms for officers throughout the war, stood in her workshop with fabric still pinned to her cutting table, unable to move. Her hands, so steady with needle and thread, trembled now. She thought of her brother, lost at Guadalcanal. She thought of her father, who had taught her that the nation would never surrender, that every citizen would fight with bamboo spears if necessary. And now this. The silence after the broadcast was unlike any silence she had known. It was the silence of a people who had been told one story for so long that the sudden reversal felt like the ground opening beneath them. In the days that followed, fear settled over Kure like the ash that still drifted from Hiroshima, 30 kilometers to the northeast. The propaganda had been relentless. The enemy would show no mercy. They would violate women, torture men, enslave children. The Americans were demons, the British were cruel, and the forces massing for occupation would exact revenge for every battle, every ship sunk, every life lost. Michiko watched as neighbors began hiding valuables, burying family heirlooms in gardens, sending daughters to relatives in the countryside. Old men who had served in the Russo-Japanese War 40 years earlier spoke in hushed tones about what occupying forces did to defeated populations. The younger men, those who had returned wounded or been discharged before the final battles, said nothing at all. They had seen enough to know that whatever was coming would be unlike anything the propaganda had described, but they had no words to prepare anyone for it. The waiting was agony. Every distant sound of an airplane made people freeze. Every rumor that swept through the markets sent families scrambling. The police had largely disappeared. The military structure had collapsed overnight. In that vacuum, fear grew unchecked. Takeshi worked at the railway station in Kure, coordinating what remained of the freight operations that had once supplied the Imperial Navy. He was 43, too old for frontline service, but young enough to have spent the war years working brutal shifts, watching trains carry young men away and bring back wounded, then fewer and fewer trains carrying anything at all. On the morning after the surrender, he reported to work out of habit more than duty. The station was nearly empty. A few colleagues sat on benches staring at nothing. The tracks stretched away into the haze, going nowhere. Someone had removed the portraits of the emperor from the office walls, leaving clean rectangles where the frames had hung. Takeshi found himself thinking about his son, who was 9 years old, and what kind of world the boy would inherit. He thought about the stories he had heard about Nanking, about Manila, about what Japanese forces had done in occupied territories. He had pushed those thoughts away during the war, had told himself that those were necessary actions, or exaggerations by enemy propaganda, or the actions of rogue units. Now, with defeat settling over everything, he could not stop thinking about them. If occupation meant retribution, if the forces coming meant to do to Japan what had been done in their name elsewhere, then his son's future was darker than any he could imagine. The teachers at the local school had an impossible task. They had spent years teaching children to revere the emperor as a living god, to embrace death before surrender, to hate the enemy with every fiber of their being. Now they were supposed to teach those same children to accept defeat, to submit to occupation, to somehow continue living in a world where everything they had been taught was revealed as a failed ideology. Mr. Sato, who had taught history for 20 years, sat in the empty classroom after the term ended abruptly in mid-August, looking at the textbooks stacked on his desk. Every page was a lie or a half-truth or a distortion. He had taught those lies faithfully because he had believed them, or because he had been afraid not to, Or perhaps because the distinction between belief and fear had blurred years ago. What was he supposed to tell the children when school resumed? That their fathers and brothers had died for nothing? That the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was a fiction? That the enemy they had learned to hate were now their masters? He had no answers. All he had was the same fear everyone else carried, the fear of what would happen when the occupation forces arrived. Dr. Nakamura ran a small clinic on the outskirts of Kure, treating injuries and illnesses with increasingly scarce supplies as the war had ground down. By August 1945, he was performing surgery without anesthesia, treating burns with whatever ointments could be improvised, watching patients die from infections that penicillin could have cured if there had been any penicillin left in Japan. When he heard the surrender announcement, his first thought was not political or ideological. His first thought was whether the occupation would bring medicine. His second thought was whether he and his staff would be punished for having served the Japanese military, even in a civilian medical capacity. The propaganda had been clear that the enemy showed no mercy to medical personnel. He had heard stories, whether true or embellished he did not know, about captured doctors being executed, about hospitals being targeted, about wounded being left to die. He did not know what to believe. All he could do was continue treating the patients who came to him, preparing for a future he could not predict. The announcement came in September that the British Commonwealth Occupation Force would be arriving in the Chugoku region, with headquarters to be established in Kure. Australian troops would form the primary contingent. For most people in Kure, Australia was an abstraction, a distant land they knew almost nothing about. Some older residents remembered it as a destination for Japanese emigrants before the war, a place of opportunity. Younger people knew it only as an enemy nation, source of forces that had fought in New Guinea, in the island campaigns, in the brutal jungle warfare that had consumed so many lives. The announcement included information about the 34th Brigade, about operational zones, about command structures. It meant nothing to Michiko, to Takeshi, to Mr. Sato, to Dr. Nakamura, to the thousands of ordinary people trying to survive in a city that had been bombed, blockaded, and now waited for occupation. What it meant was that the waiting was almost over. Soon they would know what occupation actually meant, whether it would be as brutal as they feared or something else entirely. On a grey morning in early February 1946, the first Australian troops arrived in Kure. Michiko was at the market, such as it was, where vendors sold whatever scraps could be found or grown or bartered for. The market was near the harbour, and she heard the ships before she saw them. The sound of engines, of metal on metal, of organised activity that had been absent from the harbour for months. People stopped what they were doing. Some ran, others froze. Michiko stayed where she was, gripping her empty basket, watching as trucks began rolling off the transport ships, as soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms formed up on the dock, as officers consulted maps and gave orders in a language she did not understand. She had expected them to be larger somehow. The propaganda had made them seem like giants, like demons. These were just men, tired-looking men in dusty uniforms, younger than she had imagined, moving with military precision, but without the theatrical aggression she had been led to expect. They did not storm into the market. They did not grab civilians. They established a perimeter around the dock area, posted sentries, and began the methodical work of establishing a base of operations. It was so ordinary that it was disorienting. This was the enemy? These were the monsters who were supposed to ravage the city. The first patrols through Kure's streets began that afternoon. Michiko watched from her workshop window as a squad of Australian soldiers walked past, rifles slung over their shoulders, eyes scanning the buildings and alleyways. The civilians on the street pressed themselves against walls, heads down, avoiding eye contact. The soldiers maintained their formation, called out to each other in English, pointed at street signs and landmarks. They did not enter homes. They did not threaten anyone. One of them, a tall soldier with sun-weathered skin, nodded at an old woman who stood frozen in terror as they passed. It was a small gesture, almost reflexive, the kind of acknowledgement one human gives another when passing on a street. The old woman did not respond. She looked as though she might faint, but the soldier moved on without incident, and the patrol continued around the corner. Michiko realized she had been holding her breath. She exhaled slowly, feeling foolish and frightened and confused all at once. What was happening? Where was the violence? Where was the retribution? Takeshi encountered Australian troops at the railway station the next day. A detachment arrived to inspect the facilities. to assess the damage from bombing raids, to determine what could be salvaged and what needed to be rebuilt. The Australian officer in charge, a lieutenant whose nameplate read Mitchell, spoke through a Japanese interpreter, a Nisei from Hawaii who had been recruited for occupation duty. The interpreter's Japanese was formal and slightly archaic, learned from immigrant parents rather than native speakers, but it was comprehensible. Lieutenant Mitchell wanted to know about rolling stock, about track conditions, about maintenance schedules. He asked Takeshi technical questions about freight capacity and turnaround times. It was surreal. Takeshi had expected interrogation, perhaps arrest. Instead, he was being consulted as an expert, his knowledge valued because the Australians needed the railway functioning to move supplies and personnel across their occupation zone. When the inspection concluded, Lieutenant Mitchell thanked him through the interpreter. Thanked him. Takeshi bowed reflexively, unsure how else to respond, and the Australians left. He stood on the platform afterward, trying to process what had just happened. The enemy occupiers had come to his workplace and treated him with something approaching professional courtesy. It made no sense according to everything he had been taught to expect. The occupation regulations were posted throughout Kure within the first week. They were printed in both English and Japanese, though the translations were sometimes awkward. Non-fraternization was the most prominent rule. Occupation personnel were forbidden from socializing with Japanese civilians beyond what was necessary for official duties. No visiting Japanese homes, no sharing meals, no developing personal relationships. The penalties for violation were listed as severe, though not specified in detail. For the civilians, the message was clear: keep your distance. Do not attempt to interact. Obey instructions. Report to designated offices for ration distribution, medical care, and administrative matters. The tone was firm but not hostile. There were no threats of collective punishment, no warnings about resistance being met with execution, none of the savage rhetoric that had characterized Japanese military occupation elsewhere. Instead, the regulations read like bureaucratic procedures, dry and administrative, concerned with maintaining order and processing the logistics of managing a defeated population. Dr. Nakamura was summoned to a meeting at the new BCOF medical headquarters within the first month of occupation. He went expecting arrest, or at minimum a harsh interrogation about his wartime activities. Instead, he found himself in a conference room with Australian medical officers who wanted to discuss public health in the Kure area. They asked about disease rates, about malnutrition, about the state of medical infrastructure. They offered to supplement his clinic's supplies with surplus medications from occupation stores. They talked about coordinating on a vaccination program to prevent epidemic disease. The Australian doctor leading the meeting, a Major Campbell, spoke through the interpreter with technical precision, focused entirely on practical matters of keeping the civilian population healthy enough to avoid public health crises. When Dr. Nakamura mentioned his shortage of surgical supplies, Major Campbell made a note and said he would see what could be allocated. No mention was made of war crimes or retribution. No accusations were leveled. It was a medical consultation between professionals, nothing more. Dr. Nakamura left the meeting with a requisition form for antibiotics and antiseptics, feeling as though he had entered an alternate reality where the rules he thought he understood had been suspended. The ration distribution points became the primary interface between occupation forces and civilians. Lines formed every morning at designated locations, where Australian soldiers and Japanese administrators processed the distribution of rice, flour, canned goods, and other essentials. The rations were meager but reliable, more reliable than the chaotic final months of the war, when supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. Michiko stood in line one morning behind dozens of other civilians, all silent, all tense. The Australian soldiers manning the distribution point wore sidearms but kept them holstered. They checked identification papers, verified addresses, stamped ration books, and handed over allotments with mechanical efficiency. There was no cruelty in their manner, but no warmth either. They were doing a job, processing civilians, maintaining order. One of the soldiers, a corporal with red hair and freckles, made eye contact with Michiko as he stamped her ration book. He said something in English, a phrase she did not understand, but his tone was neutral, almost friendly. She bowed slightly, took her rations, and moved on. As she walked home, she thought about that moment of eye contact, about how ordinary it had been. These were the monsters she had feared. These were the occupiers who were supposed to destroy Japan, and they were handing out food with the bland efficiency of postal clerks. The non-fraternization rules were strictly enforced in the early months, but small violations occurred almost immediately. An Australian soldier helping an elderly Japanese man carry heavy bags, a group of soldiers kicking a football around in a plaza, with Japanese children watching from a distance, until one soldier waved them over, and the children cautiously approached to touch the strange leather ball. A medic treating a child's scraped knee when the mother brought him to the BCOF medical post in tears, unable to find care anywhere else. These moments were technically violations, but they were also human instincts, the impulse to help that transcends ideology and military regulations. The officers turned a blind eye to the minor infractions as long as they did not develop into anything more substantial. They understood that absolute non-fraternization was impossible when you were occupying a city, living among civilians, encountering them every day on the streets, in the markets, at the train stations. The goal was to prevent relationships from forming, to maintain professional distance, to avoid the complications that arose when soldiers became personally involved with the local population. Takeshi began to notice the Australian presence at the railway station becoming routine. The soldiers who arrived each morning to coordinate rail movements became familiar faces. There was the sergeant who always checked his watch against the station clock and made a note if they did not match. There was the young private who seemed fascinated by the Japanese characters on the signs and tried to copy them into a notebook. There was the lieutenant who brought his own thermos of tea and drank it while reviewing schedules. They were individuals, Takeshi realized, with habits and quirks and personalities. They were not a monolithic enemy force. They were men doing a job, many of them clearly wishing they were somewhere else. Home, perhaps, anywhere but here, in this defeated country, managing railway schedules. Some of them were friendly in a distant way, nodding acknowledgement when they saw him. Others were strictly professional, all business, no small talk even through the interpreter. A few seemed uncomfortable, as though they were not sure how to behave around Japanese civilians, and defaulted to stern formality to mask their uncertainty. None of them were violent, none of them were cruel. That was what struck Takeshi most forcefully as the weeks passed, the absence of cruelty. He had braced himself for beatings, for arbitrary punishment, for the casual brutality that characterized military occupation. Instead, he found himself working alongside men who treated him like a colleague, albeit one from the defeated side. Mr. Sato reopened his classroom in the spring of 1946 with new textbooks provided by the occupation authorities. All references to military nationalism had been removed. All glorification of war had been excised. The emperor was no longer a god, but a constitutional monarch. Democracy was to be taught. Individual rights were to be emphasized. Mr. Sato read through the new materials with a mixture of relief and disorientation. These were the values he had once believed in, before the militarists had taken over, before the propaganda had consumed everything. But teaching them now, under occupation, felt like collaboration even as it felt like liberation. The Australian education officer who visited his school, a Captain Harris who had been a teacher in Melbourne before the war, spoke through the interpreter about the importance of education in building a peaceful future. He asked Mr. Sato about class sizes, about student needs, about what resources would help. He did not lecture. He did not impose, he consulted. It was patronizing in its way, this assumption that the Australians knew better how to run Japanese schools, but it was not hostile. Captain Harris seemed genuinely interested in helping, in his earnest way, as though education could redeem a nation, as though teaching children about democracy could erase the past decade of militarism. Mr. Sato did not argue. He took the textbooks and the suggestions and returned to his classroom trying to figure out how to teach children who had lost fathers and brothers in a war that was now officially described as a mistake. The small gestures accumulated. An Australian soldier giving his chocolate ration to a group of hungry children, against regulations but impossible to witness without doing something. A Japanese shopkeeper bowing deeply in gratitude when occupation forces repaired the water main on his street that had been damaged in bombing raids months earlier. A mechanic at the station teaching an Australian corporal the proper way to maintain the older Japanese locomotives that were still in service. A nurse at Dr. Nakamura's clinic learning basic English phrases from the Australian medics who came to deliver supplies. These were not friendships, not yet, not officially. They were the small frictions and accommodations that occur when people live in proximity, when professional barriers cannot completely prevent human connection. The officers worried about fraternization leading to complications, and they were right to worry. Already there were rumors of relationships developing, of Australian soldiers and Japanese women meeting secretly, of marriages being planned despite regulations forbidding them. The regulations would eventually be relaxed, but in early 1946 they were still firm, and violations could end careers. Yet the connections formed anyway, slowly, carefully, hidden but persistent. Dr. Nakamura worked increasingly closely with the Australian Medical Corps as public health initiatives expanded. The Australians were concerned about tuberculosis, about dysentery, about malnutrition weakening the population's resistance to disease. They brought in additional medical supplies, set up mobile clinics in the outlying areas, and worked with Japanese doctors to identify at-risk populations. Major Campbell became a regular visitor to Dr. Nakamura's clinic, sometimes bringing other Australian medical officers, sometimes coming alone to discuss cases and coordinate care. The language barrier remained, always mediated by interpreters, but a professional rapport developed. They were both doctors, both committed to healing, both pragmatic about the realities of working in a devastated country with limited resources. Major Campbell never mentioned the war. He never asked about Dr. Nakamura's service. He focused entirely on the present, on the patients who needed care, on the public health challenges that could not wait for political reconciliation. Dr. Nakamura found himself respecting the Australian doctor, despite everything, despite the occupation, despite the national humiliation. Competence and dedication transcended nationality. This was a lesson he had not expected to learn from the occupation. Michiko's workshop struggled in the post-war economy. There was little demand for the fine sewing she had specialized in. People needed basic repairs, patching worn clothes until they fell apart. She adapted, taking on mending work, altering garments, doing whatever was needed to earn enough for food. One afternoon, an Australian soldier entered her shop, sent by another soldier who had apparently gotten his uniform torn and needed it repaired. Michiko froze, uncertain whether to accept the work, whether it was allowed, whether she would be accused of collaborating. The soldier, a private named Cooper, held up the torn jacket and made a sewing motion, universal and clear. He spoke no Japanese, she spoke no English, but the need was obvious. She nodded, took the jacket, examined the tear. It was repairable. She held up 5 fingers, indicating 5 days. He nodded, left money on the counter, more than the repair was worth, and departed. Michiko looked at the money, at the jacket, at the door through which the soldier had left. It was just business. That was what she told herself. Just business. When Private Cooper returned 5 days later, she had the jacket repaired perfectly. Seams reinforced, buttons tightened. He examined it, smiled broadly, said something enthusiastic in English, and left. Word must have spread, because more Australian soldiers began bringing repair work to her shop. It was never official, always individual soldiers on their own time, paying from their own pockets. It was against regulations, technically fraternization, but it was also commerce, the kind of practical exchange that kept people alive. Michiko did the work, took the money, and told herself it was just survival. The occupation zone extended beyond Kure to include much of the Chugoku region, with particular focus on the Hiroshima area. The Australian forces took on the grim task of helping manage the aftermath of the atomic bombing, providing security, medical support, and logistical assistance in a city that was still effectively a disaster zone months after the blast. The Japanese civilians who remained in Hiroshima, those who had survived the initial explosion and the subsequent radiation sickness, lived in a landscape of ash and ruin. The Australian soldiers who patrolled those ruins, who helped evacuate the sick, who guarded the supply depots and medical stations, many of them were visibly shaken by what they saw. Takeshi traveled to Hiroshima once on railway business, coordinating the restoration of a damaged freight line. He saw Australian soldiers loading bodies onto trucks, wearing protective equipment, their faces grim. He saw an Australian medic sitting on rubble afterward, head in hands, cigarette burning unsmoked between his fingers. The devastation was beyond anything propaganda could have prepared anyone for. It was a vision of apocalypse made real. The Australians working in Hiroshima were not conquerors surveying their victory. They were men confronted with horror, doing their duty despite the psychological cost. Takeshi understood then that the occupation forces were not immune to the trauma of what had happened here. They carried their own burdens from the war, their own losses, their own nightmares. The occupation was not simply victors ruling the defeated. It was survivors trying to build something functional from the ruins, all of them damaged in different ways. The tension between discipline and humanity played out daily across the occupation zone. The Australian command insisted on maintaining military bearing, on following regulations, on treating the occupation with professional seriousness. They court-martialed soldiers who fraternized too openly, who developed relationships with Japanese women, who violated the rules about entering civilian homes. The penalties varied, but the message was consistent. Maintain distance, maintain order. Do not forget that you are occupying a former enemy nation. Yet the soldiers themselves chafed under these restrictions. Many of them had fought in the brutal Pacific campaigns, had lost friends to Japanese forces, had endured jungle warfare and prisoner camps, and all the particular horrors of that theater. They had every reason to hate the Japanese, some did, but many others, confronted with the reality of occupation, with hungry children and desperate families, and a civilian population that seemed more traumatized than threatening, found their hatred eroding. It was hard to maintain ideological fury when you were handing out food rations to elderly women who bowed so deeply their foreheads nearly touched the ground. It was hard to sustain enemy hatred when you were helping rebuild infrastructure that everyone needed, Japanese and Australian alike. The regulations existed because the command understood how quickly sentiment could shift, how occupation could become complicated by sympathy, by guilt, by the simple human inability to remain indifferent to suffering. Mr. Sato watched his students adapt to the new reality with the resilience of children. They were hungry, always hungry, but they studied the new textbooks, learned about democracy, asked questions that would have been dangerous to ask during the war. One student, a bright girl named Yuki, raised her hand one day and asked if the Australians would stay forever. Mr. Sato did not know how to answer. The occupation had no defined end date. It would last as long as necessary, whatever that meant. He told Yuki that the Australians would stay until Japan was ready to govern itself peacefully, which was the official line but felt hollow even as he said it. Yuki accepted this answer with the seriousness of a 12-year-old trying to understand adult concepts. After class, she approached his desk and asked quietly if the Australians were good people or bad people. Mr. Sato looked at her, at this child who had lived through bombing raids and starvation and national collapse, and realized he no longer knew how to categorize people so simply. The Australians were occupiers, which made them automatic enemies in the old framework. But they were also men who distributed food, who provided medical care, who maintained order without mass executions or collective punishment. Were they good or bad? They were human, complicated, capable of kindness and cruelty, following orders while maintaining individual consciences. He told Yuki that people were more complicated than good or bad, that the Australians were doing their job, and that she should focus on her studies. It was an inadequate answer, but it was honest. Yuki nodded and returned to her seat. Mr. Sato wished he could give his students certainty, clear moral frameworks, but that was what the war had destroyed. Certainty was a luxury of the past. The Australian soldiers struggled with their own complicated feelings about the occupation. Letters home, later archived and studied by historians, revealed men torn between duty and doubt. They wrote about the destruction they saw in Japanese cities, about the obvious starvation and desperation, about children with swollen bellies and old people too weak to stand in ration lines. They wrote about maintaining discipline, about following regulations, about treating the Japanese with firm fairness. They also wrote about guilt, about wondering if the atomic bombs had been necessary, about seeing victims who looked like anyone's grandmother or nephew or daughter. Some letters expressed satisfaction at seeing Japan defeated, a sense of justice for Pearl Harbor and the fall of Singapore and the prisoner camps. Other letters expressed discomfort with the occupier role, a desire to go home, a weariness with war and its aftermath. The soldiers were not monolithic. They were individuals processing a morally complex situation as best they could, following orders while wrestling with their own consciences. By late 1946, the occupation had settled into routine. The initial fear among Japanese civilians had not disappeared, but it had transmuted into something more complex. Resentment mixed with grudging acceptance. Humiliation coexisted with relief that the occupation was less brutal than expected. The Australians remained a visible presence throughout Kure and the surrounding region, running security checkpoints, managing supply distribution, overseeing reconstruction efforts. The relationship between occupier and occupied remained formally distant, But the small violations of non-fraternization continued to accumulate. Takeshi learned that one of the Australian officers at the station had studied Japanese before the war, could read the characters and speak haltingly. This officer, Lieutenant Morrison, sometimes practiced his Japanese with Takeshi during quiet moments, asking how to say railway terms, correcting his pronunciation. It was strange to teach the enemy your language, but it was also oddly pleasant. These brief conversations that pretended the war and occupation did not exist, that they were simply two men discussing language and trains. Lieutenant Morrison once mentioned that his father had worked in Yokohama in the 1920s, that he had grown up hearing stories about Japan, that he had wanted to visit before the war made that impossible. There was wistfulness in his voice, a sense of loss for a world that might have been if history had turned differently. Takeshi said nothing, but he felt a similar wistfulness. His son would grow up in an occupied country, learning about democracy from foreign textbooks, eating rations distributed by foreign soldiers. What might have been if the militarists had not gained power, if the war had been avoided, if different choices had been made at 100 different junctures? These were pointless questions, but they arose anyway, in quiet moments, when the weight of everything became too much. Dr. Nakamura attended a medical conference organized by the occupation authorities in early 1947. Japanese and Australian doctors presented papers on public health challenges, on treatment protocols for radiation sickness, on managing nutrition deficiency diseases. The conference was held in what had been a naval academy building, now repurposed for occupation administration. Dr. Nakamura presented findings from his clinic about tuberculosis rates and treatment outcomes. An Australian doctor presented research on the long-term effects of atomic radiation, data that was simultaneously horrifying and clinically fascinating. During a break, Dr. Nakamura spoke with Major Campbell about the difficulty of obtaining certain medications. Major Campbell mentioned that he was rotating back to Australia in a few months, that another medical officer would take over liaison duties. They had worked together for over a year, had coordinated care for thousands of patients, had developed what might almost be called a friendship if the occupation dynamic had not made friendship impossible. Dr. Nakamura felt an unexpected sadness at the news of Major Campbell's departure. The Australian doctor had been professional, respectful, committed to healing regardless of nationality. He represented the better aspects of the occupation, the recognition that human suffering transcended politics. After the conference, they shook hands, a Western gesture that felt awkward but meaningful. Major Campbell said through the interpreter that he had been honored to work with Dr. Nakamura, that Japanese medical professionals had shown remarkable dedication under impossible circumstances. Dr. Nakamura bowed and thanked him. It was as close to reconciliation as the occupation would allow. Michiko's repair work for Australian soldiers became semi-regular. She had a reputation now for quality work, fair prices, and discretion. Soldiers came to her shop to have uniforms altered, to repair civilian clothes they wore on leave, to fix personal items. She learned to recognize regulars, to nod in greeting, to communicate through gestures and the few English words she had picked up. One soldier, Corporal Williams, brought her a photograph once showing a young woman and two children in front of a house, his family, presumably. He pointed at them, said names Michiko could not retain, smiled with obvious homesickness. She nodded, understood that he was trying to establish humanity, to show her that he was more than an occupying soldier. She appreciated the gesture, even as it made her uncomfortable. These men had families, lives, identities beyond their uniforms. They were not demons. They were husbands and fathers and sons, separated from home doing a job they probably did not enjoy in a country that did not want them. Michiko thought about her brother, dead in the Pacific, and wondered if he had seemed equally human to the enemy who killed him, or if war reduced everyone to categories and targets. She did not know. She finished the repair work, took her payment, bowed Corporal Williams out of her shop and tried not to think too deeply about the strange intimacy of mending a soldier's clothes while his country occupied hers. The occupation regulations relaxed incrementally. By 1947, the strict non-fraternization rules were being reinterpreted. Social events between Japanese civilians and occupation personnel were still officially discouraged, but no longer absolutely forbidden. Mixed marriages, previously prohibited, were now being considered on a case-by-case basis. Cultural exchange programs were established, allowing Japanese and Australian officials to discuss art, music, literature, anything that might build bridges between the two populations. These programs were awkward, heavily supervised, more propaganda than genuine exchange, but they represented a shift in occupation philosophy. The goal was no longer just security and order. It was rehabilitation, reintegration, transformation of Japan into a peaceful democracy that could rejoin the international community. The Australians were not solely responsible for this shift. The overall occupation policy was set by the Allied command with American dominance, but the Australian contingent implemented these policies in their zone with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some officers embraced the rehabilitation mission. Others remained skeptical, preferring strict security measures to trust-building exercises. The Japanese civilians responded with similar ambivalence. Some welcomed the relaxation of rules, the opportunity for slightly more normal interaction. Others viewed it as manipulation, as occupation forces trying to make their presence more palatable while maintaining fundamental power imbalances. Mr. Sato participated in a cultural exchange program in late 1947, teaching Australian officers about Japanese history and literature. It was surreal to sit in a room with men who had recently been enemy combatants and discuss the tale of Genji, to explain the aesthetics of wabi-sabi, to translate haiku and watch them struggle to grasp concepts that did not translate easily into English. The Australian officers were polite, attentive, genuinely interested or at least professionally committed to appearing interested. One captain, a man who had taught English literature before the war, engaged in a lengthy discussion about the influence of nature imagery in Japanese poetry compared to British romantic poetry. It was an intelligent conversation, the kind Mr. Sato had not had in years, and he found himself forgetting momentarily that he was speaking with an occupier. The conversation ranged across literature, philosophy, aesthetics, all the subjects that had been subordinated to military propaganda during the war. When the session ended, the captain thanked him sincerely and said he hoped they could continue the discussion at future sessions. Mr. Sato agreed, bowed, and left feeling intellectually stimulated and emotionally conflicted. The occupation was not supposed to include intelligent conversations about poetry. It was supposed to be brutal and oppressive. Yet here he was, engaging in literary analysis with enemy officers, finding common ground in shared appreciation for art. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Takeshi witnessed a fight break out at the railway station in mid-1947. Two Australian soldiers got into an argument that escalated into shoving and punches. The Japanese workers scattered, expecting violence to spread, expecting collective punishment for witnessing the incident. Instead, Australian military police arrived within minutes, separated the combatants, took them into custody, and dispersed the crowd. An Australian sergeant apologized to Takeshi for the disruption, explained through the interpreter that the soldiers would face disciplinary action, and asked if anyone had been injured in the altercation. No one had. The sergeant nodded, made a note in his report, and left. The entire incident was handled with bureaucratic efficiency, no different than how the Japanese railway police might have handled a similar situation before the war. Takeshi realized that the occupation forces were subject to their own discipline, that they did not have carte blanche to behave however they wished. This should not have been surprising, but it was. The propaganda had depicted enemy forces as savage, uncontrolled, acting on base instincts without restraint. The reality was military discipline, codes of conduct, consequences for violations. The Australian soldiers who fought at the station were not simply released with a warning. Takeshi later heard they had been court-martialed, reduced in rank, possibly sent home in disgrace. The occupation command took internal discipline seriously. It had to maintain order, to present a professional face, to avoid incidents that could escalate into broader conflict. But knowing this intellectually and witnessing it were different things. The professionalism was both reassuring and destabilizing. It was easier to hate an uncontrolled enemy than a disciplined occupier who treated misconduct among his own troops as seriously as resistance from the occupied population. The black market flourished alongside the official ration system. Australian soldiers sometimes participated, trading occupation goods for Japanese items, alcohol for art, cigarettes for ceramics. These exchanges were illegal, violations of military regulations and occupation law, but they happened constantly. The economic incentives were too strong. Japanese civilians needed goods the occupation forces had. Australian soldiers wanted souvenirs, sake, personal services. A parallel economy developed, Cash and barter mixed, operating in the shadows of the official system. Michiko knew which soldiers were willing to pay premium prices for tailoring work done quickly and discreetly. She knew which merchants would trade fabric for cigarettes, thread for canned goods. She participated in this economy because survival required it, because the official rations were insufficient, because the alternative was starvation or worse. The occupation authorities knew about the black market, but pursued it selectively. Major operations were shut down. Casual exchanges were generally ignored unless they became too blatant. The unspoken understanding was that complete enforcement was impossible, that some economic interaction between occupier and occupied was inevitable, that as long as it remained small-scale, it was better to tolerate than to suppress and drive further underground. This pragmatism characterized much of the occupation. Rules existed but were applied with discretion. Authority was maintained but not absolute. It was occupation management rather than occupation tyranny, which was both a relief and a form of control, more insidious for its reasonableness. Dr. Nakamura treated an Australian soldier in early 1948 for a severe infection that had not responded to initial treatment. The soldier, Private Henderson, had been referred to the civilian clinic because the military medical post was overwhelmed with other cases. Dr. Nakamura examined the infection, determined it needed aggressive treatment, and over the next 2 weeks, he and his staff worked to save the soldier's leg from amputation. Private Henderson was young, barely 20, and terrified. Through the interpreter, he thanked Dr. Nakamura repeatedly, said he did not want to go home crippled, begged for any treatment that might help. Dr. Nakamura did not mention that he had treated similar infections in Japanese soldiers during the war, that he had performed amputations when infection overwhelmed available treatments, that medical practice was medical practice regardless of which army a patient served. He simply treated the infection with the antibiotics provided by the Occupation Medical Corps, monitored progress, adjusted dosages, and eventually saved the leg. When Private Henderson was discharged, he shook Dr. Nakamura's hand with tears in his eyes and said something in English that the interpreter translated as profound gratitude. Dr. Nakamura accepted the thanks with a slight bow and moved on to his next patient. Later, Major Campbell's replacement, a Captain Foster, came to the clinic and thanked Dr. Nakamura for the treatment, said Private Henderson had written home about the Japanese doctor who saved his leg, that the soldier's parents had sent a letter of gratitude that would be forwarded through proper channels. Dr. Nakamura did not know what to do with this information. He had done his job. The nationality of the patient was irrelevant to medical ethics. Yet clearly it meant something to the Australians. This act of healing across enemy lines, this demonstration that Japanese doctors could treat occupation soldiers without sabotage or malice. The incident was small, one infected leg in a years-long occupation, but it represented the daily accumulation of small demonstrations that the Japanese population was not uniformly hostile, that cooperation was possible, that former enemies could find common ground in basic human needs. The children of Kure began to lose their fear of Australian soldiers by 1948. The younger generation, those who had been toddlers during the war or born after it ended, saw the occupation forces as simply part of their reality. They watched the Australians play football in the plaza, heard their music from the barracks, saw them maintaining vehicles and equipment. Some children approached the soldiers curious, looking for chocolate or chewing gum, the universal currencies of child-soldier interaction in every occupation zone. The soldiers were explicitly instructed not to engage with children, to avoid any action that could be misinterpreted, but human nature made absolute compliance impossible. A soldier sharing his lunch with a hungry child, a medic treating a scraped knee, a corporal teaching kids to kick a football properly. These interactions were technically violations, but practically inevitable. The officers generally looked the other way unless something egregious occurred. They understood that demonizing occupation forces became difficult when those forces were playing with your children, treating them kindly, behaving like ordinary men rather than conquering enemies. This was psychological warfare through kindness, intentional or not, winning hearts and minds through chocolate and football. It was cynical in its way, but it was also genuinely kind, and the two things could coexist. The soldiers who shared food with hungry children were not thinking about strategic occupation goals. They were responding to human need. The cumulative effect, however, was political. A generation growing up with less fear of foreigners, less ingrained hatred, more willing to see individual humanity rather than enemy categories. Mr. Sato was asked to write a report for the Occupation Education Office in 1948 about the progress of democratic education in his school. He struggled with what to say. The students were learning the new curriculum. They could recite democratic principles, but did they believe them? Did they understand them? Or were they simply learning new propaganda to replace the old? Mr. Sato was not sure himself. Democracy was appealing in theory, but the reality was that his country was occupied, that decisions were made by foreign powers, that Japanese sovereignty was suspended indefinitely. How was he supposed to teach democracy while living under occupation? The contradiction was fundamental. He wrote his report carefully, emphasizing student engagement and progress, while avoiding any hint of criticism that could be construed as resistance. The occupation authorities wanted to hear that their education reforms were working. Mr. Sato gave them what they wanted, because that was what survival required. But he did not know if he was helping his students or teaching them to accept subjugation as normal. The moral ambiguity gnawed at him. He had been complicit in military propaganda during the war, teaching children to glorify violence and sacrifice. Now he was complicit in occupation propaganda, teaching children to embrace democracy imposed by force. Perhaps all education was propaganda in some form, he thought bleakly. Perhaps the best he could do was teach critical thinking skills and hope his students would someday use them to evaluate everything they had been taught, including what he was teaching them now. The Australian forces began rotating home in larger numbers by 1949, as the occupation transitioned to a longer-term presence with fewer troops. Michiko noticed fewer soldiers coming to her shop for repairs. The railway station saw reduced Australian presence as more responsibilities transferred to Japanese administrators under occupation supervision. Dr. Nakamura worked increasingly with Japanese colleagues rather than Australian medical officers. The intensity of occupation was diminishing, though it would not officially end until 1952. The presence became more administrative, less militarized, more bureaucratic than martial. The Japanese population had mixed feelings about this transition. Some welcomed the reduced foreign presence, seeing it as a step toward regaining sovereignty. Others worried about economic disruption as occupation spending decreased. The occupation had brought money, goods, employment. What would replace it? The Australian soldiers who had occupied Kura for years were being replaced by administrators and advisors. The relationship was changing from occupation to something more nebulous, a continuing foreign presence with less direct control. Takeshi attended a farewell ceremony at the railway station in mid-1949 when Lieutenant Morrison transferred back to Australia. It was informal, just the Australian contingent at the station and a few Japanese workers who had collaborated closely with them. Lieutenant Morrison gave a brief speech through the interpreter, thanking everyone for their cooperation, expressing hope for Japan's future, the usual diplomatic pleasantries. But afterward he approached Takeshi personally and shook his hand, speaking in his halting Japanese to say that working together had been an honor, that he hoped Japan would rebuild and prosper. Takeshi was surprised by the emotion in the Australian officer's voice. Morrison seemed genuinely moved, his usual professional reserve cracking slightly. Takeshi bowed and thanked him, finding himself also unexpectedly emotional. They had worked together for over 3 years, coordinating railway operations, solving logistical problems, maintaining civil discourse despite the fundamental inequality of occupier and occupied. It had been a strange partnership, but it had functioned. Morrison's departure marked the end of an era, not just personally but symbolically. The occupation was winding down. Normal relations, whatever that meant, were slowly emerging. Takeshi watched the Australian officers depart the station one last time, heading to the port for transport home, and felt conflicted. Relief that the occupation was diminishing, sadness at the departure of men he had worked alongside, uncertainty about what came next. Japan was still not fully sovereign, still under Allied control, but the intensive military occupation was ending. The future was murky, full of questions without clear answers. By 1950, Kure was transitioning from occupied city to something approaching normalcy, though the occupation technically continued. The Australian presence had diminished significantly. Most of the soldiers had rotated home, replaced by a smaller administrative contingent. Japanese government functions were being restored under Allied supervision. The economy was slowly recovering, though still fragile. People were no longer starving, though prosperity remained distant. Michiko's repair shop had regular customers now, both Japanese and the few remaining Australians. She had expanded to also sell some new clothing, small items she could source from wholesalers who were starting to operate again. Her business was modest but stable. She thought sometimes about the fear she had felt in August 1945, the certainty that occupation would mean death or violation or destruction. Instead, it had meant years of tense coexistence, of gradual normalization, of learning that former enemies could interact without inevitable violence. She did not forgive the war. She did not forget her brother. But she had learned that people were more complicated than wartime propaganda allowed, that Australians could be professional and sometimes kind, that occupation did not have to mean brutality, even if it meant subjugation. Dr. Nakamura reflected on the occupation years in a journal he kept sporadically. He wrote about the medical cooperation, about lives saved through access to occupation supplies, about the strange professional relationships that had developed. He wrote about Major Campbell and the other Australian medical officers who had worked with Japanese doctors rather than simply imposing their will. He acknowledged the fundamental inequality, the power imbalance that always existed between occupier and occupied, but he also noted the unexpected professionalism, the commitment to public health regardless of nationality. The occupation had brought medicine when Japan had none. It had helped control epidemic disease that could have killed thousands. It had rebuilt medical infrastructure. These were positive outcomes from a situation born of defeat and subjugation. Dr. Nakamura struggled to reconcile gratitude with resentment, relief with humiliation. The occupation was ending slowly, and he would be glad to see full sovereignty restored, but he could not deny that the Australian Medical Corps had helped save Japanese lives, had treated civilian suffering as something to be alleviated, rather than ignored or exploited. That mattered, even if it could not erase the fundamental injustice of occupation itself. Mr. Sato watched his students graduate in 1951, young adults now, ready to enter a Japan that was emerging from occupation and war trauma. They had learned democracy from textbooks written by the occupiers. They had learned to question authority after being taught to blindly obey it. They were a transitional generation, caught between the militarist past and the uncertain democratic future. Some would thrive in the new Japan being built. Others would struggle with the rapid changes. All of them carried the weight of history, the knowledge that their country had been defeated, occupied, fundamentally transformed by force. Mr. Sato hoped he had taught them to think critically, to question, to learn from the past without being paralyzed by it. He did not know if he had succeeded. Teaching was always an act of faith, a hope that seeds planted would eventually grow in ways you could not predict or control. As he watched his students leave the school for the last time, he felt the peculiar melancholy of endings, the awareness that this chapter was closing, that the occupation years would soon be history rather than present reality, that these young people would carry forward whatever lessons they had learned from living through national defeat and reconstruction. The occupation officially ended in 1952 with the Treaty of San Francisco. The Australian forces departed, responsibilities transferred to Japanese authorities, sovereignty restored. The end was anticlimactic, more bureaucratic than dramatic. Takeshi went to work at the railway station on the day sovereignty was restored and found that operations continued exactly as they had the day before. The trains still ran. The schedule still required coordination. The work continued. The absence of Australian military presence was notable, but not disruptive. Japan was responsible for itself again, for better or worse. Takeshi thought about the years of occupation, about the fear that had preceded it, about the gradual normalization that had occurred. The Australians had not been the brutal conquerors he had expected. They had been professional occupiers, strict but generally fair, maintaining order without mass violence, treating Japanese civilians as defeated people rather than subhuman enemies. This was not praise exactly. Occupation was occupation, subjugation regardless of how it was administered, but there had been a choice in how to conduct it, and the Australians had chosen discipline over revenge, regulation over rampage. That choice had mattered. It had shaped how the occupation was remembered, how the relationship between former enemies evolved afterward. Takeshi did not know if he was supposed to be grateful for this, or if gratitude was inappropriate for the manner in which you were occupied. He settled on acknowledging that it could have been much worse, that low expectations had been exceeded, that survival had been possible in ways he had not anticipated. Michiko closed her shop on the day of sovereignty restoration and walked through Kure looking at the city that had been rebuilt slowly over 7 years. Buildings had been repaired, infrastructure had been restored. The port was functional again, though not at wartime capacity. Life had returned to something approaching normal, though the scars remained. She thought about the Australian soldiers who had occupied her city, about the fear that had gradually transformed into wary coexistence. She thought about Corporal Williams and his photograph of his family, about the young men who had brought her repair work, about the ordinary interactions that had accumulated over years until the enemy had become individual human beings rather than an abstracted threat. The occupation had been humiliating in its way, a constant reminder of defeat, but it had also been surprisingly mundane. Food rations and railway schedules and medical care, the business of managing a defeated population without destroying it. Michiko did not know what to feel about the occupation ending. Relief, certainly. Pride that Japan would govern itself again, but also a strange sense of closure on a period that had defined her adult life. The war had taken her brother. The occupation had forced her to adapt, to survive, to see complexity where propaganda had promised only binary good and evil. She was not grateful for the occupation, but she was grateful to have survived it, and grateful that it had been conducted with more restraint than she had feared. In those terrible August days of 1945, the memory of the occupation would shape Japanese-Australian relations for decades afterward. The generation that had lived through it carried complicated feelings, resentment mixed with grudging respect, humiliation tempered by acknowledgement that worse occupations had occurred elsewhere. The Australians who served in the BCOF carried their own memories of occupied cities and desperate civilians, of trying to maintain discipline while responding to human need, of the strange experience of occupying a former enemy without becoming consumed by hatred. Some veterans spoke with pride about the professionalism of the occupation, about maintaining standards, about treating Japanese civilians firmly but fairly. Others spoke of the moral complexity, of never feeling entirely right about occupying someone else's country, regardless of how carefully it was done. The relationships formed during those years, marriages that occurred despite regulations, friendships that developed between former enemies, business connections that grew from occupation necessity, these became threads connecting the two countries, small bridges built from the rubble of war. The official diplomatic relationship would normalize over time, economic ties would strengthen, but the human connections formed during occupation, the individual memories of how people treated each other in that strange, suspended period between war and peace, those would remain foundational to understanding how former enemies could eventually become partners. The historians would debate the occupation's success or failure, whether it transformed Japan effectively, whether the methods used were appropriate, whether alternative approaches might have worked better. The civilians who lived through it had simpler assessments. They had survived, their children had survived. The occupation had not destroyed them. The society that emerged was different from what had existed before the war, shaped by defeat and reconstruction and foreign influence, but it was still recognizably Japanese. The Australians had come as conquerors and left as former occupiers. The relationship permanently changed but not irredeemably poisoned. There would be controversies, disagreements, lingering resentments. But there would also be the memory that occupation could be conducted with discipline, that former enemies could treat each other with a baseline of human decency, even in the most unequal of power relationships, that fear of brutality could be replaced not with love or